Aho hisuyayo. Opawaje saptan chanche.
Hey everyone, what's up? Welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about half an hour of history together in each episode. My name's Jason Kishineff, and we're reading An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Remember, if you like the video, if you like the show, go ahead and hit that like button and that subscribe button. Go ahead, wait, do it. I'll wait while you do. Did you hit the button yet? Great. Let's dig in. The mythical foundation of settler patriotism. Between 1814 and 1824, 3/4 of present-day Alabama and Florida, a third of Tennessee, a fifth of Georgia and Mississippi, that's 20% for those who are not great in math, and parts of Kentucky and North Carolina became the private property of white settlers, all of the land seized from indigenous farmers. In 1824, the first permanent U.S. colonial institution was established. First named the Office of Indian Affairs and placed tellingly within the Department of War. Shocker! The agency was transferred to the Department of Interior 25 years later, following the annexation of half of Mexico. In making this transfer, the federal government showed overconfidence in assuming that armed indigenous resistance to U.S. aggression and colonization had ended. Such resistance would continue for another half century. Whereas white supremacy had been the working rationalization for British theft of indigenous lands and for European enslavement of Africans, the bid for independence by what became the United States of America was more problematic. Democracy, equality, and equal rights do not fit well with dominance of one race by another, much less with genocide, settler colonialism, and empire. It was during the 1820s, the beginning of the era of Jacksonian settler democracy, that the unique U.S. origin myth evolved, reconciling rhetoric with reality. Novelist James Fenimore Cooper was among its initial scribes. Cooper's reinvention of the birth of the United States in his novel The Last of the Mohicans has become the official U.S. origin story. Herman Melville called Cooper our national novelist. Cooper was the wealthy son of a U.S. congressman, a land speculator who built Cooperstown, named after himself in upstate New York where he grew up. I'm a big baseball fan, and I did not know that Cooperstown was named after James Fenimore Cooper. His hometown was christened All-American with the establishment of the National Baseball Hall of Fame there in 1936. That's what I'm talking about. During the Depression, expelled from Yale, Cooper joined the Navy. Expelled from Yale, Cooper joined the Navy, then married and began writing. In 1823, he published The Pioneers, the first book in his Leatherstocking Tales series. Leatherstocking Tales series. The other four being The Last of the Mohicans, The Prairie, The Pathfinder, and The Deerslayer. the last published in 1841. Each featured the character Natty Bumppo, also called variously, depending on his age, Leatherstocking, Pathfinder, or Deerslayer. Bumppo is a British settler on land appropriated from the Delaware Nation and is buddies with its fictional Delaware leader, Chingachgook, the last Mohican in the myth. Together, the Leatherstocking tales narrate the mythical forging of the new country from the 1754 to 1763 French and Indian War in the last of the Mohicans, to the settlement of the plains by migrants traveling the wagon train from Tennessee. At the end of the saga, Bumppo dies a very old man on the edge of the Rocky Mountains as he gazes east. The Last of the Mohicans, published in 1826, was a bestseller throughout the 19th century and has been printed continuously since, with 2 Hollywood movies based on the story, the most recent made in 1992, the Columbus Quincentennial. Cooper devised a fictional counterpoint of celebration to the dark underbelly of the new American nation, the birth of something new and wondrous, literally, the U.S. American race, a new people born of the merger of the best of both worlds, the native and the European. Not biological merger, but something more ephemeral, involving the dissolving of the Indian. In the novel, Cooper has the last of the noble and pure natives die off, as nature would have it, with the last Mohican handing the continent over to Hawkeye, the nativized settler, his adopted son. His convenient fantasy can be seen as quaint at best, if it were not for its deadly staying power. Cooper had much to do with creating the U.S. origin myth to which generations of historians have dedicated themselves, fortifying what historian Francis Jennings has described as exclusion from the process of formation of American society and culture. And I think we are quoting Francis Jennings here. In the first place, they, U.S. historians, exclude Amerindians, as also Afro-Americans, from participation, except as foils for Europeans, and thus assume the American civilization was formed by Europeans in a struggle against the savagery or barbarism of the non-white races. This first conception implies the second, that the civilization so formed is unique. In the second conception, uniqueness is thought to have been created through the forms and processes of civilization's struggle on a specifically American frontier. Alternatively, civilization was able to triumph because the people who bore it were unique from the beginning, a chosen people or a superior race. Either way, American culture is seen as not only unique, but better than all other cultures, precisely because of its differences from them. Burn! U.S. exceptionalism weaves through much of the literature produced in the United States, not only the writing of historians, although Wallace Stegner decried the devastation wrought by imperialism on indigenous peoples in the land, he reinforced the idea of U.S. uniqueness by reducing colonization to a twist of fate that produced some charming characteristics. And I think we're quoting Wallace Stegner here. She really does her quotations strangely. I don't know, maybe it's the editor, maybe I should have blamed the author, but it's like it's set aside from the other paragraph and it's indented, but there's no actual quotation marks. So I think this is Wallace Stegner. Ever since Daniel Boone took his first excursion over Cumberland Gap, Americans have been wanderers, with the continent to take over and manifest destiny to goad us. We could not have avoided being footloose. The initial act of emigration from Europe, an act of extreme, deliberate disaffiliation, was the beginning of a national habit. It should not be denied either that being footloose has always exhilarated us. It is associated in our minds with escape from history and oppression and law and irksome obligations with absolute freedom, and the road has always led west. Our folk heroes and our archetypal literary figures accurately reflect that side of us. Leatherstocking, Huckleberry Finn, the narrator of Moby Dick, all are orphans and wanderers. Any of them could say, "Call me Ishmael." The Lone Ranger has no dwelling place except the saddle. The British novelist and critic D.H. Lawrence, who lived in northern New Mexico for 2 years, conceptualized the U.S. origin myth invoking Cooper's frontiersman character Deerslayer. You have there the myth of the essential white America. All the other stuff, the love, the democracy, the floundering into lust, is a sort of byplay. The essential American soul is hard, isolate, stoic, and a killer. It has never yet melted. That didn't sound very nice. It's probably why he only lived there for 2 years. Historian Chpt points out that non-fiction sources of the time reflected the same view. The United States Magazine and Democratic Review summed it up by arguing that whereas European powers conquer only to enslave, America, being a free nation, conquers only to bestow freedom. Oh man, nailed that. Far from being antagonistic, empire and liberty are instrumentally conjoined. If the former stands to safeguard the latter in turn serves to justify the former. Indeed, the conjunction of the two, of freedom and dominion, gives America its sovereign place in history, its manifest destiny, as its advocates so aptly called it. I'm going to read that again, not the whole thing. Whereas European powers conquer only to enslave, America, being a free nation, conquers only to bestow freedom. Ain't that the truth? I can feel some of you getting butthurt over my laughing at that. I can feel it. Look into your history. Watch the videos that from this channel, from A People's History of the United States, starting in about 1898. And watch those. Learn something. Reconciling empire and liberty based on the violent taking of indigenous lands into a usable myth allowed for the emergence of an enduring populist imperialism. Wars of conquest and ethnic cleansing could be sold to the people. Indeed, could be fought for by the young men of those very people by promising to expand economic opportunity, democracy, and freedom for all. The publication arc of the Leather Stocking Tales parallels the Jackson presidency. For those who consumed the books in that period and throughout the 19th century, generations of young white men, the novels became perceived fact, not fiction, and the basis for the coalescence of U.S. American nationalism. Behind the legend was a looming real-life figure, the archetype that inspired the stories, namely Daniel Boone, an icon of U.S. settler colonialism. Boone's life spanned from 1734 to 1820, precisely the period covered in the Leatherstocking series. Boone was born in Berks County, Pennsylvania, on the edge of British settlement. He is an avatar of the moving colonial indigenous frontier. To the west lay Indian country, claimed through the doctrine of discovery by both Britain and France, but free of European settlers save for a few traders, trappers, and soldiers manning colonial outposts. Daniel Boone died in 1820 in Missouri, a part of the vast territory acquired in the 1803 Louisiana Purchase, when when Missouri opened for settlement. The Boone family led the initial settlers there. His body was taken for burial in Frankfort, Kentucky, the covenant heart of the Ohio country, Indian country, for which the Revolution had been fought, in which he had been the trekker superhero, almost a deity. Daniel Boone became a celebrity at age 50 in 1784, a year after the end of the War of Independence. Real estate entrepreneur John Filson, with an F, Filson, seeking settlers to buy property in the Ohio country, wrote and self-published The Discovery, Settlement, and Present State of Kentucky, along with a map to guide illegal squatters. The book contained an appendix about Daniel Boone, purportedly written by Boone himself. That part of the book on Boone's adventures subsequently was published as The Adventures of Colonel Daniel Boone in the American Magazine in 1787, then as a book. Thereby, a star was born. The mythical hero, the hunter, the man who knows Indians, as Richard Slorkin has described this U.S. American archetype. The myth of the hunter that had grown up about the figure of Filson's Daniel Boone provided a framework within which Americans attempted to define their cultural identity, social and political values, historical experience, and literary aspirations. Daniel Boone, Washington, Franklin, and Jefferson were heroes to the whole nation because their experiences had reference to many or all of these common experiences. The Hunters of Kentucky, a popular song that swept the nation in 1822 to 28, helped elect Andrew Jackson as president by associating him with Boone, the hero of the West. Yet the Leatherstockings' positive twist on genocidal colonialism was based on the reality of invasion, squatting, attacking, and colonizing of the indigenous nation. Neither Filson nor Cooper created that reality. Rather, they created the narratives that captured the experience and imagination of the Anglo-American settler. Stories that were surely instrumental in nullifying guilt related to genocide and set the pattern of narrative for future U.S. writers, poets, and historians. Commander-in-Chief. Andrew Jackson is enshrined in most U.S. history texts in a chapter titled The the age of Jackson, the age of democracy, the birth of democracy, or some variation thereon. The Democratic Party claims Jackson and Jefferson as its founders. Every year, state and national Democratic organizations hold fundraising events they call Jefferson-Jackson dinners. I did not know that. They understand that Thomas Jefferson was the thinker and Jackson the doer in forging populist democracy for full participation in the fruits of colonialism based on the opportunity available to Anglo settlers. Jackson carried out the original plan envisioned by the founders, particularly Jefferson, initially as a Georgia militia leader, then as an army general who led 4 wars of aggression against the Muskogees in Georgia and Florida, and finally as a president who engineered the expulsion of all native peoples east of the Mississippi to the designated Indian Territory. As the late Cherokee principal chief Wilma Mankiller wrote in her autobiography, that's an awesome name, the fledgling United States government's method of dealing with native people, a process which then included systematic genocide, property theft, and total subjugation, reached its nadir in 1830 under the federal policy of President Andrew Jackson. More than any other president, he used forcible removal to expel the eastern tribes from their land. From the very birth of the nation, the United States government truly had carried out a vigorous operation of extermination and removal. Decades before Jackson took office, during the administration of Thomas Jefferson, it was already cruelly apparent to many Native American leaders that any hope for tribal autonomy was cursed. So were any thoughts of peaceful coexistence with white citizens. I'd like to give you a minute to sit on that one. It's not that Jackson had a dark side, as his apologists rationalize, and which all human beings have, but rather that Jackson was the Dark Knight in the formation of the United States as a colonialist, imperialist democracy, a dynamic formation that continues to constitute the core of U.S. patriotism. The most revered presidents, Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, Wilson, both Roosevelts, Truman, Kennedy, Reagan, Clinton, Obama, have each advanced populist imperialism while gradually increasing inclusion of other groups beyond the core of descendants of old settlers into the ruling mythology. Should we read that again? Maybe we should. The most revered presidents, Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, Woodrow Wilson, both Roosevelts, Teddy and FDR, Truman, Kennedy, Reagan, Clinton, and Obama, have each advanced populist imperialism while gradually increasing inclusion of other groups beyond the core of descendants of old settlers into the ruling mythology. It's quite a sentence. I hope you're hip to that. I know I am. All the presidents after Jackson march in his footsteps. Consciously or not, they refer back to him on what is acceptable, how to reconcile democracy and genocide, and characterize it as freedom for the people. Jackson was a national military hero, but he was rooted in the Scots-Irish frontier communities, most of whose people, unlike him, remained impoverished. Their small farms were hard-pressed to compete with large plantations with thousands of acres of cotton planted and each tended by hundreds of enslaved Africans. Land-poor white rural people saw Jackson as the man who would save them, making land available to them by ridding it of Indians, thereby setting the pattern of the dance between poor and rich U.S. Americans ever since under the guise of equality and opportunity. When Jackson was inaugurated in 1829, he opened the White House to the public. The majority in attendance began being humble poor whites. Jackson was easily reelected in 1832, although landless settlers had acquired very little land, and what little they seized was soon lost to speculators, transformed into ever larger plantations worked by slave labor. The late Jackson biographer Michael Paul Rogan observed, Indian removal was Andrew Jackson's major policy aim in the quarter century before he became president. His Indian wars and treaties were principally responsible for dispossessing the southern Indians during those years. His presidential Indian removal finished the job. During the years of Jacksonian democracy, 1824 to 1852, 5 of the 10 major candidates for president had either won reputations as generals in Indian wars or served as Secretary of War, whose major responsibility in this period was relations with the Indians. Historians, however, have failed to place Indians at the center of Jackson's life. They have interpreted the age of Jackson from every perspective but Indian destruction, the one from which it actually developed historically. Once elected president, Jackson lost no time in initiating the removal of all the indigenous farmers and the destruction of all their towns in the South. In his first annual message to Congress, he wrote, "The emigration should be voluntary, for it would be as cruel as unjust to compel the Aborigines to abandon the graves of their fathers and seek a home in a distant land. But they should be distinctly informed that if they remain within the limits of the states, they must be subject to the laws. In return for their obedience as individuals, they will without doubt be protected in the enjoyment of those possessions which they have improved by their industry." This political code language barely veils the intention to forcibly remove the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, and Seminole nations, followed by all other indigenous communities from east of the Mississippi River, except for the many who could not be rounded up and remained without land, without acknowledgement, until the successful struggles of some of them for recognition in the late 20th century. The state of Georgia saw Jackson's election as a green light and claimed most of the Cherokee Nation's territory as public land. The Georgia legislature resolved that the Cherokee Constitution and laws were null and void, and that Cherokees were subject to Georgia law. The Cherokee Nation took a case against Georgia to the U.S. Supreme Court. Good for them. Although I guess we all know how it's not going to go well. With Chief Justice John Marshall writing for the majority, the court ruled in favor of the Cherokees. Oh, well, there you go. Jackson ignored the Supreme Court, however, in effect saying that John Marshall had made his decision and Marshall would have to enforce it if he could. Although he, Jackson, had an army, while Marshall did not. While the case was working its way through the courts, gold was discovered in Georgia in 1829, which quickly brought some 40,000 eager gold seekers to run roughshod over Cherokee lands, squatting, looting, killing, and destroying fields and game parks. Under authority granted by the Indian Removal Act, passed by Congress in 1830, the United States drew up a treaty that would cede all Cherokee lands to the government in exchange for land in Indian Territory. The U.S. government held Cherokee leaders in jail and closed their printing press during negotiations with the few hand-picked Cherokees, who provided the bogus signatures Jackson needed as a cover for forced removal. Did you enjoy the episode? Go on, hit that like and subscribe button. Tune in to the next episode. I'll see you then. Thanks for joining me.